Well, good morning. It's fantastic to see such a good crowd, and lots of old friends, and I'm happy to meet lots of new colleagues too. So my job is to talk about developments since the last ICFUST meeting, which is just about a year ago. And as I went through, they're really happy, a lot of really good developments. So let me first talk about sources. So the standard state-of-the-art source at the moment remains the krypton chloride hexanolamp. And this is a photo of our very first Far-UVC lamp, krypton chloride lamp that we purchased from Edward Sosnin in Tomsk in the Soviet Union, 2011. Big, clunky copper fan, but has never ever broken. When all the other lamps are broken, this is the one we go to. We all think that the future is in LEDs, and most of you have seen a picture somewhat like this, with wavelength as a function of quantum efficiency or wall flow efficiency, which is almost the same in this context. And this is the picture that you would have seen last year, and you see it 220 nanometers, not yet above 1%. But actually, we've broken the 1% barrier has been broken this year, and a paper by Kobayashi in Japan this year has got 4% efficiencies. As anyone in the field knows, you pay for that in terms of lifetime, and so the lifetime of those lamps that are marked there is 100 hours-ish, which they can increase by reducing the current, but they don't want to reduce the current. So there is still a ways to go in the LED world, but we're absolutely moving in the right direction. Not the only type of innovative Far-UVC sources around. People have been thinking for a while about taking a 444 nanometer laser light, which is easy and inexpensive to generate, and then using a frequency doubler or wavelength halver to convert that to 222. So there's been a recent paper that just came out in 2024 where they've shown some really good progress in that regard. Again, not there yet, but it is an alternative to the LED approach. And yet a third approach is a wavelength shifter. So the idea here is you start off with a nice high efficiency 172 nanometer xenon lamp, and then you aim that at phosphors, and the phosphors can then convert that to a higher wavelength. So you see a list of 172 nanometer sensitive phosphors there. And there's a couple that will absorb the 172 and emit 233 and then 225. Again, still a ways to go, and a recent paper on trying to improve the efficiency of that approach. And yeah, I think there is a poster at this meeting. Okay, so that source is certainly going in the right direction. So the second aspect, of course, is Far-UVC efficacy. Does it work? That's really we have two questions: does it work, and is it safe? So this is, does it work? And over the last year, there have been a number of papers come out on inactivation rates for Far-UVC for a wide range of pathogens, including some very insensitive ones. But in general, no big variations in sensitivity. And that's sort of understandable in the UV world because the damage is random in the DNA and the RNA, and in the case of Far-UVC, the protein too. And in general, Far-UVC and activation rates are higher than 254 nanometer in activation rates, which we understand broadly because of the involvement of the protein interactions. And I wrote this last bullet, still comparatively few measurements in aerosol pathogen, airborne pathogens within aerosols. And as I wrote that, on the day I wrote that, actually, a paper came out on just that. Looking at 222 to 365 nanometer light in aerosols, and for a variety of different pathogens. So there are more data out there than had been a year ago. If you put it all together, it's still pretty scattered. And there are a number of reasons for that. One of them is some of the data is airborne, some of it is water-based. Another aspect to that is the fact that it does seem that if you go into some detail on the dose-response curve, the survival against dose, in this case for C43 pathogen, you get a biphasic dose-response curve. That seems to be pretty common in the UV world. So a steep initial slope and a less steep final slope. So if you don't analyze this with a biphasic equation, you'll get essentially the wrong answer. You get something like that red line, which is trying to put a straight line through all this data, which clearly is not a good idea. So I think a lot of the issues with variable K are to do with the fact that there is not one single K for these pathogens, and it really should be the low dose K that we should be using. And in the last year, more and more locations have installed Far-UVC. Not as many as any of us would wish, but we're getting there. So I just list a few here, including the last Olympics. Of course, what we really want is to install the lamps in public places and then measure the efficacy one way or another. So the first whole room efficacy study was reported at the meeting last year and published last year, and that's from UNED and colleagues at physically at Leeds University. And the results were super promising. You see the results on the top right there for both for a relatively low exposure and for a much higher exposure. They got 35 air changes per hour or 180 air changes per hour. The calculation you have to do to go from a percentage reduction in pathogens to an air changes per hour has a number of assumptions built into it, and they may not be right. So perhaps it's better to be looking simply at a percent reduction in live airborne pathogens rather than the equivalent air changes per hour. That is the way that you can compare with other air cleaners. And since last year, a second installation has been reported with measurements of decreased levels of pathogens. This one is in a mouse cage cleaning room at Columbia University. So there is an awful lot of murine norovirus in the air. So there's lots of, there are people, so this is an occupied space, which is actually a first time we've done measurements in an occupied space. But it's set up to succeed because there's a lot of norovirus in the air. And succeed, I think we did. So we used an average Far-UVC dose corresponding to 13 millijoules per centimeter squared per 8 hours, and a peak of 79. And what we got was 99.8% reduction in the level of pathogens in the air, which is obviously super promising. Another installation, again at Columbia, this in a very large dental clinic. And you can see this, you don't see the whole of the dental clinic here, it's enormous. This is a more difficult study because this was really very well ventilated. It's a modern facility, so there really weren't that many pathogens in the air to start with. And we measured the decrease in bacterial airborne pathogens, and we got basically a 50% reduction, but with quite large error bars. And again, there wasn't much to start with, which made this a somewhat difficult study to do. Okay, let's turn to safety. And most of you have seen these two pictures before, which indicate the rationale for safety, the stratum corneum in the case of skin, and the tear layer in the case of the eye. So things are looking pretty good, I think, for skin. There's been publications where people have gone to enormous doses, this one from Edie and colleagues, and really not seen anything significant. And this is a long-term study in mice, more than a year's exposure to a variety of different doses. And again, not seeing any evidence for abnormal skin pathology. And this is actually quite a good conservative model because the stratum corneum in mice is actually thinner than the stratum corneum in humans. And we sort of understand what's going on here because it really is the protection from the stratum corneum. So this is an artificial skin model grown from skin stem cells and looking as a function of individual wavelengths as to how much DNA damage you're seeing in the epidermis. And really you don't see anything until about 235, and then you start to see an increase in your damage, and that's the penetration through the stratum corneum. So I had always assumed basically the story was going to be the same with the eye, and that what you've got is the tear layer, and that's acting in the same way as the stratum corneum in the skin. But it seems it's not quite that way. So this is some data which Manuela Guanana will be presenting this week, so I don't want to take steam away, but essentially what we're seeing is that the tear layer doesn't actually produce that much protection, a little bit, but it's really the superficial cells in the cornea which are providing the protection from the lower intermediate cells, or wing cells, and the even lower basal cells. So what you see in the graph, again as a function of wavelength, is when you look at the superficial cells right at the top, you are seeing a fair amount of DNA damage. But when you go to the intermediate, or certainly the basal cells, you're not. And I mean, that's fine, because the superficial cells, they are essentially doomed, that they're functionally dead, and that there is a movement of cells through the cornea and then ultimately out through the tear layer. So these superficial cells are just sitting there waiting to be moved out into the tear layer. And so any damage there is not really of any functional significance. But again, it is a little bit different, we think, from the skin situation. And again, since the last meeting, there have been a couple of publications of eye discomfort in real life installations. One right here in St. Andrews in a simulated office, and one in Japan in a medical exam room. And both of them were reported, well, no short-term ocular discomfort in one case, and no short or long-term adverse ocular events in the other case. Okay, and then the third aspect of safety that came up very much in the last ICFUST meeting is the question of production of ozone and then the interaction of the ozone with particles in the air to produce ultrafine particulates. And what we've seen in the last year is really, 5 minutes, thank you. What we've seen in the past year really has been quite a dichotomy between the conclusions that have been drawn by folks who are using ozone test chambers and conclusions that have been drawn by people doing similar measurements but in real life rooms. And yeah, there's a couple of interesting real life room studies which prima facie would be a more relevant situation. So this is a study in a Baltimore hotel room, and I think this is being reported at this meeting, and there is a preprint out on the internet in a moment. So this is a reasonably well sealed room with an air exchange rate of 1.4 per hour. And they saw an increase in ozone concentration of when they turned the lamps on, of 5 parts per billion. But when they looked at the changes in ultrafine particle concentration, actually they saw a decrease. And from which, I mean, they didn't conclude that the decrease was due to the Far-UVC. They concluded that there were other factors that were entirely dominating the changes in particle concentration. In a second study at Columbia University by Faye McNeil and her colleagues in the chemistry department, again using a very fancy and very expensive particle counter sizer, again in a small conference room with a typical air change per hour of 1.3. And looking at the particle count before and after the Far-UVC lights were turned on, didn't see anything at all. And if you look at the particle distribution size before and after, again, didn't see anything at all. So there's no doubt that these effects exist, but they are generally at higher exposures than are going to be realistic in real life situations. And forgive me for popping in one paper which is not in the last year and not in the last decade, not in the last 2 decades, from Charles Wexler and colleagues in 2001. He did a calculation of looking at the competition between ozone plus VOCs producing ultrafine particles and ventilation. What level of ventilation would balance out the production of these ultrafine particles. So they identified 18 common VOCs in indoor air. They assumed 50 parts per billion ozone, which is a lot more than any Far-UVC lamp can produce. And then essentially used known cross-sections to calculate the ventilation rate that would match the ozone plus VOC ultrafine particulate production rate. And here's their results. So these are the different typical VOCs that are in the air, probably in this room too. And on the right are the ventilation rates, which match those particle production rates from 50 parts per billion of ozone interacting with those VOCs. And the ventilation rates that you need to balance out or to counteract that ultrafine particle production are small. Very small in most cases, and with the very highest cross-section, which is limonene, which is the lemon cleanser that we all use, you still only need about 1/8 air change per hour to counteract that. So again, the feeling is it's certainly an issue, but it's not really an issue at the sorts of levels that we're going to use Far-UVC at and in real life rooms. And there I will finish. Thank you for your attention.